After more than 30 years sitting on this bench, I thought I had seen every dark corner of the human heart. I have seen career criminals tremble when faced with the weight of their choices. I've seen the poor maintain a quiet, unbreakable dignity in their darkest hours. And I've seen the powerful shattered by the simple, cold reality of justice. But then, on a gray Thursday morning, a 32-year-old man walked into my courtroom. He didn't carry a weapon. His arsenal was a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, a $20,000 bespoke suit from Savile Row, and a smirk so sharp it could cut through stone, a smile that told me, plain as day, that he believed he was untouchable. His name was Julian Vance, the CEO of Silicon Valley's largest data conglomerate. And he stepped into this room with the absolute conviction that he was the smartest person in the building, perhaps the smartest person in the world. Even now, when I recall the look in Julian's eyes that day, I feel a chill. Not because I was intimidated, but because I realized how deeply money, power, and lines of code can distort a human soul. Are you listening to me? Because if you stay with me, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when a man who thinks he is the creator of the digital world is stripped bare in the light of the law. Do me a favor right now, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. This isn't just a trial. It's a masterclass in how quickly hollow pride can collapse when it hits the wall of accountability. My courtroom is not a flashy stage. It is an old room smelling of damp oak and decades of archived paper. It is a place where the truth is exhaled, where there is no room for PR spin or media whitewashing. Julian Vance didn't understand that. He arrived with 3 of the most expensive attorneys in the country, men carrying crocodile skin briefcases and wearing cologne that smelled of old money and offshore accounts. They strode in as if they were attending a board meeting where they held all the voting shares. The case seemed straightforward. Allegations of massive data fraud and a deliberate cover-up of a system glitch that wiped out the life savings of thousands of retirees. But Julian's demeanor showed zero remorse. He wasn't worried. He spent his time swiping through a gold-rimmed smartphone, sighing and checking his Patek Philippe watch as if we were all inconveniencing his disruptive schedule. He didn't even glance at the victims sitting in the gallery, the elderly couples who had lost everything. To him, they weren't people. They were edge cases, mere glitches in his grand algorithm. That cold, calculated indifference was exactly what made me decide, today the mask comes off. At TO, 45 AM, the air in the courtroom shifted. It was no longer just about legal arguments or technical jargon. It became about flesh and blood. I called the first witness to the stand, Mrs. Eleanor Higgins. She was 74 years old, a retired kindergarten teacher from Warwick who had spent 35 years shaping young minds. She walked to the stand slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched a small, faded leather purse. Her coat was neat but thin, a garment bought a decade ago and cared for with the kind of precision only someone living on a fixed income understands. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I didn't see anger. I saw a profound, quiet exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes when you've done everything right your whole life, only to have the floor pulled out from under you by someone you've never met. As she began to speak, I glanced over at Julian Vance. He didn't even have the decency to look at her. He was leaning back, whispering something to his $900 an hour lead counsel, Mr. Sterling. Julian gave a short, dismissive laugh at whatever Sterling said, then went back to inspecting a microscopic speck of dust on the sleeve of his $20,000 suit. He was physically in the room, but mentally, he was already at his next venture capital gala. To him, Mrs. Higgins was just a data point in a failed beta test. Your Honor, Mrs. Higgins started, her voice thin but steady. I worked for 35 years. I saved every penny. I wanted to make sure I wasn't a burden to my children. When the Vance Wealth app told me my balance was zero, I thought it was a mistake. I called their office 14 times. Each time, a voice told me it was a temporary system synchronization issue. Then, a month later, they sent me a letter saying my funds were unrecoverable due to a user-end security breach. They blamed me, Judge. They said, I must have lost my password, but I have it written right here, in my Bible, exactly where I put it 3 years ago. I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. My father used to tell me, Francesco, a man who steals with a pen is no different from a man who steals with a gun, except the man with the pen Thinks he's too refined to go to jail. I looked at Julian's hands, soft, manicured, never having known a day of hard labor. Then I looked at Mrs. Higgins' hands, knobby joints, weathered skin, the hands of a woman who had actually built something. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice cutting through the hushed room like a blade. Julian didn't look up immediately. He finished a text message first. I waited. 5 seconds of dead silence. Finally, he clicked his phone off and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. Yes, Judge? Is there a problem? He asked, his tone dripping with the unearned confidence of a man who has never been told no. The problem, Mr. Vance, is that I am speaking to you, and you are looking at a screen, I replied. In this courtroom, the human being on that stand is the only data that matters. Do you have anything to say to Mrs. Higgins regarding the glitch that took her life savings? Julian shrugged, a lazy, fluid motion. With all due respect, Your Honor, my company processes billions of transactions. In any massive infrastructure, there is a margin of error. It's math. It's not personal. We offered her a credit for our next premium service tier as a gesture of goodwill. I'm not sure what else she wants. The gallery gasped. Mrs. Higgins flinched as if she had been struck. Julian had just called her life's work a margin of error. He didn't realize it yet, but in that moment, he hadn't just insulted a witness, he had just handed me the shovel he was going to use to dig his own grave. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when the truth stops being a suggestion and starts being a wall. It's a heavy, pressurized silence. After Julian Vance dismissed Mrs. Higgins as a margin of error, the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it froze. I looked at Julian. He was leaning back again, already checking his watch, his mind likely on a flight to Cabo or a merger meeting. He thought he had won because he had used big words like infrastructure and optimization. But justice has a way of waiting for the arrogant to trip over their own shoelaces. I turned my attention to a blue folder that my clerk, Christina, had placed on my desk just moments before the hearing began. This wasn't part of the initial discovery. It was an anonymous submission from a whistleblower within Vance's own innovation lab, someone who still had a conscience left. I opened the folder slowly. The paper felt crisp, but the words on it were filthy. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice low. You testified under oath 10 minutes ago that you had no prior knowledge of specific fund failures before the official audit. You called it a random system synchronization issue. Is that correct? Julian didn't even look up from his palm. That is the technical reality, Your Honor. My engineers handle the specifics. I deal with the vision. I can't be expected to track every decimal point. Vision, I repeated. It's a word people like Julian use when they want to pretend they're too important to care about the people they're stepping on. Well, let's test that vision. I have a document here. It's an internal memo dated June 12th, 2024. The subject line is liquidity optimization. Does that ring a bell? For the first time that morning, Julian's thumb stopped moving on his phone. His lawyer, Mr. Sterling, stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. Your Honor, we haven't seen this document. We object to its introduction without proper review. Overruled, I snapped. This is a sentencing hearing for a series of glitches. Mr. Sterling, the truth doesn't need an appointment. I looked back at Julian. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, thin line. In this memo, Mr. Vance, you specifically directed your team to, and I quote, deprioritize the reimbursement of accounts with balances under $50,000 to maintain the appearance of growth for Series C investors. You went on to say, the elderly users are the least likely to pursue legal action. They'll just think they forgot their passwords. Let them wait. The room exhaled a collective gasp. Mrs. Higgins let out a small, broken sob. Julian's face went from a pale, expensive tan to a mottled gray. The creator was suddenly looking very human and very trapped. I leaned forward, my robe heavy on my shoulders, my eyes locked on his. You didn't have a glitch, Julian. You had a strategy. You didn't lose their money. You chose to keep it. You calculated their silence into your profit margins. He tried to find his voice, but it came out cracked. That's out of context. That was a high-level discussion about resource allocation. No, I said, that was a high-level discussion about theft. You looked at people like Mrs. Higgins, and you didn't see human beings, you saw obstacles to your next billion. You lied to this court, you lied to your users, and you lied to yourself if you thought I wouldn't find out. I could see the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, right at the hairline of his perfect $200 haircut. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was shattered. And we were just getting started. The gasp that swept through the gallery wasn't just a sound. It was the collective realization that the golden boy of Silicon Valley was nothing more than a common thief in an expensive wrapper. For a moment, the heavy silence of the courtroom was broken only by the frantic scratching of pens from the reporters in the back row. Julian Vance was no longer looking at his Patek Philippe. He wasn't checking his gold-rimmed phone. He was staring at that blue folder on my desk as if it were a coiled cobra ready to strike. His lead counsel, Mr. Sterling, was on his feet again, his face a mask of calculated desperation. Your Honor, this document is a clear violation of proprietary trade secrets. It was clearly stolen by a disgruntled former employee. We move for an immediate stay of proceedings to investigate the source of this illegal leak. I leaned back, my chair creaking a sound that felt like the gears of justice grinding forward. I looked Sterling in the eye. He was a man who made millions by obscuring the truth with proprietary walls. Mr. Crease, Sterling, I said, my voice cold and flat. We are in a sentencing hearing for a man whose trade secrets have left thousands of elderly citizens choosing between their medicine and their groceries. In this room, the only terms and conditions that matter are the ones written in the United States Code. Your motion is denied. Sit down. Sterling sat. The confidence was draining out of the defense table like water from a cracked vase. I turned back to Julian. I wanted to see the man behind the algorithm. Mr. Vance, you spoke earlier about math and optimization. You spoke about the margin of error. But this memo doesn't talk about errors. It talks about targeted attrition. It talks about how your software was specifically coded to delay the reporting of losses to users over the age of 65 because, and I am reading your own words here, they are less likely to navigate the digital appeal process efficiently. Julian's jaw tightened. The sweat I had seen earlier was now a visible sheen on his forehead. Your Honor, he began, trying to regain that smooth, TED Talk cadence. It was a stress test. We were simulating how the system would handle a liquidity crisis. That memo was a theoretical exercise. Theoretical? I asked, my voice rising just enough to let him know his time was up. Mrs. Higgins' bank account is zero. That isn't theoretical. The heart attack Mr. Miller suffered when he saw his retirement disappear? That wasn't a simulation. You didn't just steal their money, Julian. You stole their peace. You stole the years they had left where they didn't have to worry. I looked at him, really looked at him. I used to study physiognomy as a hobby. And Julian Vance was a textbook case of a man who believed his own reflection was more important than the sun. But beneath that $20,000 suit, there was a hollowness. He didn't see the people. He saw the exit. I have been on this bench for a long time, I said, and I have learned that a lie is like a digital virus. It starts small, it replicates, and it eventually crashes the entire system. You thought your vision made you immune to the laws of morality. You thought that because you could build a world of code, the real world couldn't touch you. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on him. But the real world is here now, Mr. Vance, and it's demanding an audit. I could see Julian looking toward the side door. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He was hunted. And as I turned the page in that blue folder, I saw the one thing that would ensure he never looked at a margin of error the same way again. The air in the courtroom was so thick you could almost taste the electricity. Julian Vance was no longer the untouchable titan of industry. He was a man staring at the wreckage of his own deception. I looked down at the blue folder again, then up at him. I noticed something his lawyers hadn't, a slight, rhythmic tapping of his left foot, hidden beneath the mahogany table. His hands were clasped so tightly that his knuckles were as white as the fine porcelain my wife, Joyce, keeps in the china cabinet. He was trying to hold himself together, but the algorithm of arrogance was failing. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. When you took the stand earlier, you stated for the record that the Vance Wealth app had no manual override for individual account liquidations. You said the system was fully autonomous. Do you stand by that statement? Julian swallowed hard. I could see the pulse thrumming in his neck, a telltale sign of a man whose heart is running faster than his excuses. Yes, Your Honor. The decentralization of the ledger is the core of our security architecture. No human hand can interfere with the protocol. That sounds very impressive, I replied, leaning over the bench. Decentralization, protocol, architecture. It's funny how people use complicated words to hide simple sins. It's like a plumber trying to explain why your toilet is overflowing by talking about fluid dynamics instead of just admitting he left a wrench in the pipes. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder, a technical log. This is a record of a manual override executed from an administrative terminal on the night of August 14th. The IP address traces back to your private office in Palo Alto. At 11:42 p.m., while the rest of the world was sleeping, someone used a master key to transfer $4.2 million from inactive accounts, mostly belonging to retirees, into a high-yield buffer account used to inflate your quarterly earnings. Report. Sterling, the lead lawyer, looked like he was about to have a stroke. Your Honor, this is unverified data. We have no way of knowing who was at that terminal. I think we do, I said, pointing to the bottom of the log. Because the master key used to authorize the theft wasn't just a password, it required a biometric thumbprint. Your thumbprint, Julian. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Julian looked down at his right thumb, the one he had been using all morning to swipe away the lives of others. He looked at it as if it belonged to a stranger. My father used to say that a man who lies to his own mirror eventually forgets what he looks like, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. You didn't just automate a glitch, Julian. You personally walked into the digital vaults and picked the pockets of people who weren't even there to defend themselves. You looked at a screen and saw numbers. But I look at this log and I see Mrs. Higgins' medicine. I see the college tuition of a grandson she'll never get to help. I see the sweat and the years of 1,000 people who actually worked for a living. I paused, watching the sweat drip from his chin onto his $20,000 suit. The fabric was expensive, but it couldn't hide the smell of fear. You thought you were a ghost in the machine, untouchable and invisible. But in this courtroom, we don't believe in ghosts. We believe in evidence. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The creator was finally speechless. He reached for his water glass, and for the first time, everyone saw it. His hand was shaking so violently that the water spilled over the rim. The mask was gone. The man was exposed, and the audit was just beginning. The courtroom was no longer a place of debate. It had become a place of reckoning. Julian Vance sat staring at his trembling hands, the spilled water soaking into the sleeve of his $20,000 suit. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life building a fortress of glass, only to realize that justice is a hammer. His lead counsel, Mr. Sterling, was whispering frantically into his ear, his face pale, likely calculating how this disaster would affect his firm's reputation. But Julian wasn't listening. He was looking at the gallery, at the rows of faces he had spent years ignoring. I let the silence hang in the air. In a courtroom, silence is often more powerful than the loudest shout. It forces a man to sit with his own reflection. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice steady and cold. Your attorney spent the last hour talking about your different background. He talked about your contributions to innovation and your status in the community as if they were credits you could use to buy your way out of a crime. He even suggested that a substantial donation to a tech literacy fund would be a constructive resolution. I leaned forward, the shadows of the bench falling across the blue folder. I've heard that word a lot lately. Constructive. In my world, it usually means hush money dressed as charity. It's the belief that if you write a big enough check, the moral scale resets to zero. But here's the problem with that logic, Julian. You can't donate your way out of contempt. You can't buy back the sleep Mrs. Higgins lost. You can't optimize the dignity you stripped away from people who worked 50 years for the money you stole in 50 milliseconds. Julian finally looked up. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked cynicism. What do you want from me, Judge? He spat, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and lingering entitlement. I'm a billionaire. I run the infrastructure of the modern world. You're sitting in a dusty room in a city that's forgotten by time. We are not the same. My time is worth more than the collective lives of everyone in this room. That's not an opinion, that's the market. The room inhaled sharply. It was the truth he usually only whispered in boardrooms. He had finally said it out loud. He believed his wealth made him a different species. You're right, Julian, I said, and the room went still. We are not the same. But you've got the math wrong again. You think you're at the top of the pyramid, looking down. But from where I sit, looking at the law, you're at the bottom. Because Mrs. Higgins, with her thin coat and her faded purse, has something you will never be able to code: character. She has the respect of her community. She has a life built on service, not extraction. She is worth 10 of you, and she didn't need a single line of code to prove it. I saw Sterling close his eyes and rub his temples. He knew. He knew that Julian had just committed the ultimate sin in a courtroom. He had shown the judge that he was incapable of being humbled. Power is not proven by how many people you can force to wait, I continued, my voice growing deeper. Power is proven by how you behave toward the people who can't force you to behave well. You failed that test, Julian. You failed it every time you clicked that override button. You didn't just break the law. You broke the social contract that keeps us from being animals. I picked up my pen. It was time to start calculating the real cost of his vision. Julian looked toward the door, but the bailiff, Officer Miller, moved just a few inches to block the path. The creator was finally trapped in a system he couldn't hack. I picked up my pen. It's a simple black fountain pen that I've used for over a decade. It doesn't cost $60,000 like the watch on Julian Vance's wrist, but in this room, at this moment, it carries the weight of a mountain. I looked at Julian one last time. He was trying to straighten his tie, trying to pull the tattered pieces of his billionaire persona back together. But his eyes were wide, darting toward the clock, toward his lawyers, toward the exit, anywhere but at the truth sitting on my desk in that blue folder. Julian, I said, and the room fell into a silence so deep it felt like we were underwater. You've spent your entire career building systems that operate in the dark. You've hidden behind algorithms, offshore accounts, and a legal team that costs more per hour than Mrs. Higgins made in a month. You thought that if you made the deception complicated enough, the law would eventually get bored and look away. I leaned forward, my gavel resting under my palm. But justice isn't an algorithm. It doesn't get tired, and it doesn't have a margin of error. You stood in this courtroom, under oath, and you lied to me. You looked at that flag, you looked at these people, and you claimed a system glitch was responsible for your master key being used. You didn't just steal money, you tried to steal the integrity of this court. Mr. Sterling started to rise, his mouth opening to offer one last constructive objection. I didn't even look at him. Sit down, counselor. Your client has done enough talking for one lifetime. I turned back to Julian. The sentencing guidelines for the initial fraud charges suggested a term of 3 to 5 years. Your lawyers argued for probation and a fine, claiming your vision is too valuable to be locked behind bars. They think the world will stop spinning if you aren't there to disrupt it. I paused, and I could see Julian's chest heaving. He thought he was about to hear a number he could live with. He thought he could buy his way into a white-collar facility and be out in 18 months. But then, I continued, you showed me who you really are. You showed me the memo where you laughed at the elderly. You showed me the biometric log where you personally authorized the theft. And then you looked at Mrs. Higgins and told this court she wasn't your equal. In this room, that is the ultimate glitch. For the perjury for lying to this court about the manual override, I am adding 2 years to your sentence. And for the systemic, predatory targeting of the vulnerable, I am adding another 3 years of aggravated time. Julian's face went completely white. He slumped into his chair as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. That's 5 years on top of the base, he whispered, his voice finally breaking. Correct, I said, my voice echoing like a hammer. 5 extra years to think about the math of your choices. 5 extra years to realize that in the real world, the creator is just a prisoner when he builds his empire on the suffering of others. And before you think about writing a check to get out of this, let me be clear, there will be no bail pending appeal. You are a flight risk with a private jet and a billion reasons to run. Officer Miller, take him into custody. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest noise I've ever heard in that room. It was the sound of a system finally crashing. Julian Vance, the man who owned the future, was led away in silence, his $20,000 suit suddenly looking like a very expensive cage. But as the side door opened, I saw someone else waiting in the hallway, someone in a dark suit with a federal badge. The audit wasn't over, it was just moving to a higher level. Julian Vance didn't look like a creator as he was led toward that side door. He didn't look like the man who owned the future. He looked like a frightened, hollowed-out version of the person who had walked in that morning. The $20,000 suit was rumpled, the $60,000 watch was being bagged as personal property, and the smirk that had defined his career had been replaced by a 1,000-yard stare. That is what happens when borrowed power leaves the room. You finally meet the actual person standing underneath it. As the bailiff guided him out, Agent Ramirez of the FBI stepped forward into the well of the courtroom. He wasn't there for a parking violation. He handed a set of documents to my clerk, Christina. "Your Honor," he said, his voice as level and cold as a winter morning, "we are serving notice of a federal indictment. Mr. Vance is being charged with multi-state insurance fraud, wire fraud, and witness tampering related to the Vance wealth acquisition. We are requesting an immediate surrender of all travel documents." Julian's lead counsel, Mr. Sterling, didn't even argue. He just closed his briefcase. The family office, the lobbyists, the fixers, they were all pulling away, saving themselves from the blast radius of a falling titan. Julian turned back for one split second, his eyes landing on Mrs. Higgins. For the first time, he didn't look at her as a data point. He looked at her with the realization that her simple, honest truth had been the one thing his algorithm couldn't predict. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. She stood up, smoothing her thin coat. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had reclaimed her name. I leaned over the bench and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You didn't need this courtroom to be a person of value, Mrs. Higgins. You already were." Today, the world just finally acknowledged it. She gave me a small, dignified smile, the kind of smile that comes from surviving the storm, and whispered, "Thank you, Judge, for reminding me that I still matter." Those words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets of the city shining under the streetlights. My hands felt heavy on the wheel. People often ask me if I enjoy sentencing people to prison. The answer is no. There is no joy in the destruction of a life, but there is a profound necessity in the defense of the vulnerable. My father came to this country with nothing but a dream and a set of calloused hands. He taught me that equal justice isn't about treating a billionaire and a teacher the same. It's about ensuring that the billionaire's money cannot silence the teacher's truth. It's about understanding that while the law must be consistent, wisdom must always see the context. 3 months later, I received a letter from Mrs. Higgins. She told me the Vance Hardship Fund, a fund created from the seized assets of the company, had finally cleared. She wasn't just getting her money back. She was using a portion of it to fund a literacy program for children in her neighborhood. She wrote, "I want them to know that words have power and that the truth is the only thing that never crashes." I'm Judge Boyd. I've sat on this bench for 30 years because I believe in something simple. We are all equal before the law, but justice without mercy is just a machine, and mercy without accountability is just a lie. Respect costs you absolutely nothing, but it is the most valuable thing you will ever own. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. God bless you, and take care of one another.